Now today I want to discuss the subject which personally interests me most, and personally I consider this the most important of all subjects for a writer. When I say personally, I mean that I will later prove to you rationally why this is so, but I'm giving you my preference in advance. And that is the subject of plot. If you remember, we mentioned briefly the four elements of a novel. That is theme, plot, characterization, and style. Theme and plot are practically inextricable. So they are two separate attributes. We will discuss both of them, but with the emphasis on plot as to why you will see by the content of what I'll tell you. Those of you who were present at our preliminary meetings will find some of the points covered before, but I don't think that it will hurt you to be reminded of it and to hear it in an organized form. Now, by theme, I mean the summation of the abstract meaning of a story. Have I said question or no? Oh. A plot, if you remember, I defined as a purposeful progression of events. In a general sense, for a story which would be plotless, you would still have to distinguish between the theme of a story and the events, that which happens in a story. Now I want to start by giving you a few examples of how to differentiate theme from plot, and then you will be better able to see the exact limits of the definitions. For example, we'll start with my own works. Now take With the Living. The theme, that is the abstract general meaning of the story, was the individual against the state. More specifically, the evil of statism. Now, by what means did I present that theme? So showing that the state destroys the best people, and in this case, a girl and the two men who loved her. Now, when I state that's the story of a girl and the two men who loved her under a dictatorship, do you see that by this stage, I'm already talking about the plot. Incidentally, just to show you precise definitions, when I said the general theme is the individual against the collective, you can see that it's a theme which could have been handled differently. When you state it this way, you don't necessarily indicate on whose side is the author of the story. It could be a communist story with the same theme, but then the plot, the events, the meaning will be different. It could be a story, for instance, showing that the individual is evil, if you state only the most general meaning, which is the individual against the state. More than that, supposing it were a naturalistic novel, it would be then a presentation of life under a dictatorship with no sides taken. The novel would present events such as the author might see them. I don't know what kind of author he would have to be, but I can imagine. And there would be no moral sides taken at all. It would still be the theme of the individual against the state. So that when you attempt to identify the theme of any novel that you read, or when you come to work on your own stories, be very sure to make the definitions very clear to yourself, because that will help you to set the purpose and to judge what you include or not in the writing of the story. Then to repeat, the theme of With the Living is the individual against the state, and more specifically the evil of statism. Now take Anthem. The theme there actually is the importance of man's ego. More specifically, the essence of selfishness. Selfishness in my code, of course, in my sense of the word. By what means is it presented? By the method of omission, in effect, by saying, let us assume that selfishness and all concern with the ego has disappeared from human life. What would it be like? So in effect, it's a stunt method proper for a novelette, and which I would not recommend for a whole novel. But you observe what I did there. First, I present the total absence of the ego, or as near to it as a human society can come. And then, of course, the steps by which one man rediscovers the ego. Now, the plot of the story then will be the struggle of a man in a total collectivist society to rediscover selfishness. Take the fountainhead. The theme there is individualism and collectivism in a man's soul, or rather in a man's psychology, not in politics, but in a man's soul, and showing that which either principle does to a man's character. How is it shown? Through the struggle of a creative architect against the society of his time. Now, do you observe in each case the progression by which you go from the general theme to the plot line? Do you see the distinction in each case? It's by this kind of method that you can learn to distinguish the most important element in a story for the writer, namely the plot theme. The general or abstract theme can in fact be anything you wish to make, provided it's anything rational. But your work as a novelist really starts when you have identified or chosen the plot theme of your story. By plot theme, and I mean the summation and or the essential line of the events of the story. Now, as far as the theme is concerned, I want to emphasize that I deliberately stated it is the summation of the abstract meaning of the story and not of the philosophical meaning. Because, you know, I have warned you many times, a novel or a story does not necessarily have to have an explicit philosophical meaning. Don't make the mistake of thinking that a story necessarily has to have some kind of philosophical theme. Every story will have an implicit philosophy, in the same way as every man has a philosophy, whether he holds it consciously or not. The author's philosophy will be implicit in any story he writes, but it does not have to be explicit. The theme can be any generalized subject, whether historical presentation of a certain period or human emotion, human psychology, it can be anything. I mean, in little more specific terms than these, but in any of these categories. And on the subject of theme, I would say only one warning. That is, be sure that your story can be summed up to a theme of some kind. Because in today's writing, there are stories which nobody on earth could name the meaning of. There are too many books which do not have neither a plot theme nor even an overall abstract theme, which means, in effect, that you could not say why it was written. As an example, I will offer the kind of first novels which I have warned all of you against ever trying, that consist mainly of a man or a woman writing about his or her adolescent impressions. Usually childhood and their first struggle with life and period. There usually isn't even a conclusion as to whether the hero or heroine learned anything or not. No reason why the particular events are included. If asked, the author would only say, well, it happened to me. Now that it happened to you is of no importance whatever. Not to anyone, not even to you. And you are now hearing it from the arch-apostle of Sottishness. So let me explain this. What is important about you are your values and your volitional choices. That which you choose to make happen to you, or that which is of your volitional action, is important and the most important thing about you. But that which happened in a purely accidental sense of what kind of family were you born into, in what country, what happened to your neighbors, and where did you go to school, is totally unimportant. It may acquire importance only according to what you do about it. Now, coming back for a moment to that kind of modern autobiographical novel, if an author took his own experiences because he had something of wider importance, something of meaning to say about them, then it would be perfectly valid to use his own experience, preferably not to literally transcribed, but that's another matter. However, the important point that I want to stress now is that if the author has something to say about the events he chooses to write about, the events that literally happened to him, he's free to do so, and that will be a valid literary approach. But if his sole reason for writing about them is that it happened to him, not what has he concluded about it, nor what is of general importance to him and to others. If he can give his readers no reason why they should read it, except that it happened to him, then it's not a valid book, neither for the readers nor for himself. For himself, at most, that would be a diary. Now, you all know the difference between a diary and a novel, but I'm sure not by definition, and that's a definition that's important to keep in mind. A diary can become the material of a novel, just as a newspaper story can become, but neither is a novel. It's merely a miniature version of history, in the sense that it's recording some events that really happened. But as such, that's not the province of fiction. It might become the raw material of fiction. Merely listing the events of your life in a diary does not constitute a work of literature. Yet most novels today are not even good enough to be good diaries. They are not even accurate or significant journalistic transcript. They are the worst kind of subjective mixture, namely, events that happened to me, and I felt like putting this down. Now, in this kind of work, there will not be any distinguishable theme, meaning there was no purpose whatever in the author's mind for writing the whole book, and there will be no purpose for the reader to gather from it. There will be a purely subjective stringing together of words, and if the author himself cannot say why he wrote it, then that is what I would classify under the Cecil premise, if you remember the story with which I opened these lectures. There is the story of a man who strung together a lot of events that didn't connect, and when asked why was the man doing it, his answer was because he's crazy. Well, that same thing applies to the author who starts writing things, events that happen to him in a manner that he feels like using, with no purpose, no meaning, either in the presentation or in the selection. Then, in fact, if the author can offer only his feeling, not the reason of his feeling, but just the feeling as the ultimate motive for his writing it, he is the equivalent of the author of the story about the crazy man, who does things just because he's crazy. That can be of no interest to the author nor to the reader. Therefore, in relation to theme, all you must remember is that the theme, that is, the overall abstract summation of the meaning of your work should be objectively valid. You should have some objective reason to state to yourself and to any reader who might question you as to why you wrote it, what is the meaning of the work as a total. But beyond that definition, which is no more than saying you must have some rational motive and rational purpose in writing it, the choice of themes is unlimited. You may write about deep sea diving or anything you wish, provided you can state in the work and show the reader why there is any objective reason for you to be interested in the story and for the reader to be interested. But the most important and the most controversial aspect of writing, novels in particular, of plays to a lesser extent, but it applies to plays also, is the question of plot. Now, I've given a few examples from my own work. I want to give you more examples from other works also to have the distinction between theme and plot theme very firmly in mind. Of my works, I neglect the main one, which is Atlas Shrugged. Now, the theme there is, in the most overall, in a wider statement, the crucial value of the human mind. But that is too wide. More specifically than the definition of a new morality, the morality of reason. Now, would someone tell me what, in this case, is the plot theme? And to define the plot theme, remember, you simply ask yourself, by what means I present the theme?
The plot theme would be removal of the mind from life, from the generalistic world.
That's right. Or the mind on strike is actually the way in which I thought of it originally. You see the connection. That, when I say the mind on strike, that is naming an action, an event, the central event to which all the other events of the story are related. Therefore, that's the plot theme. Now take Les Miserables, for instance. There the general theme is the unhappiness or the exploitation, the injustice done to the poor or to the lower classes of society. That's the general, abstract theme. What would be the plot theme? There the plot theme is the life story of an escaped convict and his struggle to avoid being discovered by the police. That's the general plot theme, meaning what? The central line of the narrative to which all the events of the story are related. Now take Gone with the Wind. I assume many of you have read it. And I think we briefly discussed it too. The theme there is the downfall of the South during and after the Civil War, or the disappearance of the Southern way of life. And what's the plot theme? Can anyone tell me? Just think of what, by what means has the author shown, in what events has she shown the whole disintegration, the fate of the South? Whose story has she followed? Kathy?
Through the life of the heroine, she presents the effects of it. She traces it through by use of a person.
Well, almost every novel, except something unspeakably modern, would be about a person. In the modern ones, you want to be sure. No, but by theme, when you talk about plot theme, you have to be a little more specific than just a character.
The collapse of terror in the state, the people who make it up.
Would you say that that is the central line of the events? Although that's involved, and that's the main background. But is the story concerned in equal proportions with all the people who came from that estate? No?
The
the end of a certain way of life for Scarlett O'Hara and for Ashley, for all the main characters in the book. The Civil War ends, and they have to form new lives. Some of them succeed, others struggle and fail.
Yeah, but that is really, you're describing the events which you already implied in the theme when you say that end of the disappearance of the Southern way of life. Now say, what is the central line of the events through which that transition is dramatized? Vivian?
Oh, I think what I was going to say is would be similar to Sandra's, that the change in way of life would be illustrated through the changes in Scarlett's way of life.
Well, Scarlett is, of course, the key to it. No, but observe that which runs as the main line of the events. Now, Gone with the Wind is a very large-scale novel. There are a great many events, but there is a certain line of development which is followed through the whole book, and all the other events are correlated or related to it, but it leads the whole story. What? I think...
Well, would be the effect on one particular aristocratic family in the South as representative of most of them.
And the family is not really featured.
Would it be somehow related to Scarlett's relationship to Rex Butler?
Well, actually, it's Scarlett and the two men. Is the relationship of Scarlett and the two men in her life. The men whom she loved and the men who loved her. That would be Red Butler and Ashley. Because if you remember the novel, that is the main problem posed in the novel almost from the very beginning, and carrying the story to the end. In fact, as we mentioned, the end is slightly drawn longer than the theme necessitated, but in other words, the theme is slightly gets lost in the end. But the main line to which all the events in the story relate, the suspense line, meaning that which the author leaves unfinished and makes the reader anticipate and wait for developments, is the relationship of the heroine of Scarlett to the two men. Cassie?
Then, in this case, the plot theme, there's no real relationship to the theme in its statement. I mean, in the statement of the plot theme, there is no relationship to the theme.
Oh, yes. If you add just one line, the relationship of Scarlett to the two men in her life during the years of the Civil War.
In fact, the Old South and the New South
Pardon?
aren't Rex Butler and Ashley Wilkes symbols of the Old South and the New South.
That's right.
And that what you see is Scarlett turning from the Old South and is dying, turning from it in the person of Ashley, and accepting the New South in the person of Rex Butler.
That's right. That's a very good analysis, because there is an example of the plot being integrated to the theme very skillfully. That's why I consider Gone with the Wind very good literary example of plot structure. A very good novel, technically. Because, observe this, Scarlett is in love with Ashley, and she can never win him. Just as she's a Southern woman who in spirit, in effect, does not belong in the Old South. So that she belongs with Red Butler, who is, in effect, the destruction of the traditions of the Old South, and who pursues her through the whole story, and finally she knows that's the man she has to marry, or the man destined for her, in effect, using that symbolically. But that's right, the selection of the three characters was selected to symbolize the forces historically which were involved. And that makes for the good integration of the events of the story to the general theme. Cassie, you want to ask something?
No.
Now take Main Street, for instance, Sinclair Lewis's novel. As the title indicates, a typical American small town, and the story of one girl who marries the local doctor, I believe, She is yearning for culture and for some kind of intellectual life. And it's her struggle with the complete hopelessness of the Babbitt-like, the kind of small-town materialistic attitude of everybody around her. And that's briefly the story of it. Now, in such a novel, the theme would be the presentation of a typical American small town. The plot theme would be the struggle of a girl of more intellectual trends to bring culture to this town, the struggle and in effect defeat. That would be the plot theme. Only, I must stress here that Main Street, like all of Lewis's novels, is actually a plotless novel. Plotless in the sense of a structure of events. However, like as any novel, it has to have events. So that in the case of a naturalistic non-plot novel, when I say plot theme, I mean the central line of events, which in a good naturalistic novel will be present. You will be able to distinguish at least the general progression of events, even though they're not purposeful plot events. Now take Anna Karenina, Tolstoy's horror. Have you read it?
Yeah.
I deliberately say that because that's the novel which I consider worse in the class of serious literature. I mean, you have to at least grant it the respect of being a good novel of its class. But it and Madame Bovary, I think, are the two that are most vicious and most typical of the naturalistic school. Now, in that, it's the story of a married woman who falls in love with another man, leaves her husband, and finds herself totally hopelessly doomed. Why the author never makes quite clear, except, and he treats that as apparently an absolute which requires no further explanation, except that she finds herself unemployed. She has nothing to do. Since she is ostracized by society, she has no friends and nothing to do with her time. And eventually she and the lover get bored with each other. Not that they fall out of love, but that they're both left, totally reduced to each other's company, and all social contacts are cut off. So eventually the man decides that he volunteers to go in the army. That is, he was an officer by profession, but anyway, he volunteers for a dangerous army assignment in some small Balkan war, and the implication is chances are he'll be killed, but he wants to go because he can't stand this passivity and the solitary confinement with the woman he loved. And she commits suicide by jumping under the wheels of a train, you know. Horribly well-written scene. No, by that I mean, the scene is horror, the literary technique is excellent. But that's the summation of the novel. Now the theme here, you see, is actually the wages of sin is death would be the best way to put it. It has much more vicious and deeper implications. That is that it is improper to wish happiness in life. The woman is presented as the rather sympathetic character, in effect. Sympathetic in the sense that the only discernible quality, the outstanding quality about her is that she was very eager to live. She wanted to be active, to have something important in her life. We would call it, she wanted to have purpose and values. Her husband is a standard, conventional mediocrity without any values or distinction, without any purpose or meaning, and the author deliberately presents him that way. He is not a vicious character, he is just a meaningless mediocrity. The author presents the fact that the wife was much too good for him, in effect, that she was right in being bored, not morally right, mind you, but factually right. That is, that all the evidence is given why her life with her husband is boring and meaningless. Yet, she dared to break the conventions for no other reason than she wanted to be happy. which the author considers a not sufficient reason. And thereafter, the two lovers had no more resources than to be unable to make any kind of life for themselves apart from society. Therefore, the philosophical implication there is in effect, again, it's never stated openly, that there is no life for anyone outside of society. That right or wrong, you've got to accept social standards, and if you don't, then destruction and disaster follow. So that if the overall theme, the abstract theme will be the evil of adultery, or more broadly, the evil of the pursuit of happiness, then the plot theme would be the story of a woman who left her husband and was destroyed for her unconventionality. I'm sorry if I mention books that most of you have not read, but they're kind of the classics of literature, and I have not read anything modern and probably can't read. So if these examples are not clear to you, let me ask you to name novels which you have read and to state for us, with a brief synopsis, what you see as the theme and what you see as the plot theme. I'm doing this just so that to make that distinction very, very clear to you. I have one modern novel listed here, For Whom the Bell Tolls, or semi-modern, at least 15 years ago. Have you read that? If you have a general idea, that is all that's necessary to be able to distinguish the two elements. The general theme of that is the Spanish Civil War, or the struggle of what Hemingway, I think, would probably call liberals against fascists. That's the abstract theme. The plot theme is the story of an American engineer who is given the assignment of blowing up a certain bridge during the Civil War, and his romance with a girl and his death in this assignment. That would be the plot theme of the story.
Seriously, how would you break down Ulysses?
Which Ulysses, the original or James Joyce?
Joyce.
I wouldn't. I broke down attempting to read it.
Would you say that the plot theme and the themes are simultaneous in confusion?
No, you could not consider it even a novel because there is no language. There is you have to consider psychological case history. But I would say also of those people who pretend that that is literature and who see deep meanings in it, that I would say goes strictly under the Cecil premise, with one step lower. It is not even written in English.
I've taken the notion, and I just want to know if I'm correct, so you and I can refer to it. Would you say that the plot theme, then, is the means of stating the meaning, the original theme? Would that be too general?
No, that would not be exact, because the plot theme alone would not be the means. The whole story is the means. But the plot theme would be the center, the essence or the central line of the events of the story. The events, then, will add up to the theme. So that the plot theme necessarily has the relation to the theme in the sense we illustrated. That's the focus of the means. But it would be inexact to say that it is the means, because if so, then all that would have to be stated. And you can never have a plot theme that tells your whole theme without making it too diffuse. That is, if it's any kind of tight structure, the tighter the structure, the briefer your plot theme can be stated. But for that very reason, it wouldn't be sufficient to be the means of the exclusive means of your theme. Now, are there any other questions? Or is this distinction clear to everybody? Pardon?
Would you say that plot, abstract theme and plot theme are two descending levels of abstraction? That is, that the abstract theme is the most abstract statement, the philosophical abstract statement,
Yes.
and what it adds up to.
Yes.
And the plot theme somewhat concretizes that abstraction in terms of events, and then the actual story totally concretizes.
That's right. That is the exact relationship. Or if you want philosophical metaphor, but only as metaphor, as comparison, the theme is actually the spirit of the story and the plot theme is the body. Because by events, you do mean physical actions. Now, is it clear to everybody? Now, we're going to the question of why plot is of paramount importance. What we're talking about is fiction writing, which in the widest sense means the telling of a story. A story necessarily is concerned with actions. It's concerned with events. If you do merely descriptions, that is not a story. That might be an essay, or it might be an unfinished work, but when you say a story, it has to present some kind of event. Now here is where the crucial question enters, which we discussed in our preliminary sessions, but which I want to stress particularly for the newcomers, because nothing about writing will be more important than this particular question. That is the issue of free will versus determinism. And this is another example of which we will encounter constantly of the relationship of philosophy to aesthetics, specifically to literature. Now you know what the philosophical issue of free will versus determinism means. Is man free to make choices, or is he determined to act as he does? To put it in a shorter form, it's is he man or is he a robot? What form of determinism an author might hold is irrelevant. Whether he believes that it's God's will or fate or some mysterious destiny, or man's inheritance by birth, or conditioning by his background, or social conditioning, the results in the essentials of his writing will be the same. The important distinction is, does a writer regard man as a being of free will, or does he regard him as a determined being? Because it's on this distinction that all the crucial classification of your writing and yourself as a writer will be based. If essentially you are a believer in free will, then barring accidents and other bad premises on your part, you will be a plot writer. If essentially you are a believer in determinism, then no good premises will save you. You will not be able to compose a plot. Unless, and this is just a psychological aside, unless you have exempted your writing from your general view of life, which is not very likely, and even then I'm not sure whether that's the proper statement to make. By that I mean that a writer here will be determined by his actual, his deepest conviction, rather than his professed belief. If a writer's professed belief and his deepest conviction are unified, well then more power to you, then you'll be a good writer. But in most cases, a writer might claim in a general way to be a believer in free will without clear understanding, without sufficient thought given to that premise, and subconsciously, or in his basic emotional view of life, he will be a determinist. That is, he will believe that in fact men have no choice. That will show in the structure of his writing. Or vice versa. A man might consciously, and under the bad influence of modern ecologists, claim that men have no choice. But in fact, emotionally, subconsciously, in his deepest conviction, he will feel that he has choice and others have and life is interesting, and values exist, and therefore he will be a good plot writer. Now, why will this particular issue determine whether you plot writer or not? That's actually almost self-evident, but it's a very important point to understand clearly. If man has the capacity of choice, then he has the capacity to plan the events of his life. And he has the capacity to set himself purposes and to achieve it. If he has that capacity, then his life is not a series of accidents. It is not the kind of bad mother novel I mentioned earlier. Events are not just going to happen to him. He is going to choose what he makes happen. And if accidents happen, his purpose will be to overcome them. What will be significant about him is that he is the architect of his own life. If that is your view of men, then when you write about events in human life, they will be purposeful events. There will be events dealing with a man's purpose and the steps by which he achieves them. That is what will constitute a plot. Remember our definition. A plot is a purposeful progression of events. It is not an accidental string of events, but a progression centered around someone's, the hero, heroine's usually, purpose. And the motive power of the story will be the choices and the decision of the characters. You remember the definition? I think we mentioned that in our preliminary sessions. Wasn't it your definition? The difference between a plot story and a simple story, or plotless one, even one in which there are events but not plot, is as follows. That in a plot story, the connection between events are logical connections. In a non-plot story, they are empirical connections. Meaning events are connected by the fact that they happened, not by the fact that they were willed or chosen to happen. Now, here, I want to make a slight digression into pure philosophy, because you will see what important application it has to the choice of a writer, whether he's writing a plot story or merely a saga. Incidentally, you know what a saga is. It is that form of narrative or storytelling which preceded the novel historically. The novel is a fairly recent product. It's a product of the 19th century. Before that, what people had was sagas, usually popular legends that were repeated from generation to generation. The Bible would be a recorded saga. Simply a recording of the events in the life of invented characters or sometimes forgotten historical characters, like the Iliad and the Odyssey, are sagas, the relation of events in the life of gods and heroes, but they're events empirically tied together. A more modern counterpart of that would be memoirs or autobiographies. Now those are stories, but they are sagas. And whether such a story is real, like someone's memoirs, or invented, like a legend or a saga, the distinguishing attribute there is that it is plotless. It is based, in fact, on the premise that man is a determined being and records the events that happen to him, not the events that he chose. So that the distinction we are after now is a distinction between a plot story or a saga. And for that purpose, I want to call your attention to two philosophical concepts defined by Aristotle, and that is the concept of final or efficient causation. For those of you who don't know it, I will define it briefly. Aristotle listed 4 different types of causation which he observed in nature, 2 of which are not relevant here and are dubious by definition. But the 2 that are crucially important is first that which we refer to as causality scientifically, and which Aristotle calls efficient causation. By that he means an event which is determined by an antecedent cause. That is, for instance, that's simply what we mean by causality as it exists in physical nature. For instance, if I push this ashtray, it will fall. Now that is an example of efficient causation. My hand, the movement of my hand is the cause, and the fall of the ashtray is an event. If you strike a match to a gasoline tank and it explodes, that's an example of efficient causation. That is, the match is the cause, rather the striking of the match is the cause, and the explosion is the effect. Efficient causation is what we normally understand by causality. One event necessitates another, causes another. Now, another form of causation, which Aristotle defines, is the concept of final causation. And by final causation, he meant that the end result of a certain chain of causes is what determines those causes. As an example, what he gave is this, that the final result, which is the tree, is the final causation of the seed from which the tree will grow. Now there are 2 ways to look at the same phenomenon. One is that the seed is the efficient causation of the tree. That is, first you have the seed, and as a result of that, as a consequence of that cause, the tree grows. And it grows in this kind of form which was contained in that seed. But if you look at the same phenomenon from the aspect of final causation, Aristotle said that the future shape of that tree determined the nature of the seed and the kind of development that the seed had to follow in order to end up as that tree. As an aside, as an example of one of my major quarrels with Aristotle, or differences from him, it is a very dubious, or in fact totally wrong view of nature to assume what philosophically is known as teleology, namely that there is a purpose set in advance in nature which determines physical phenomena. In other words, the concept of the future tree determining the nature of the seed is an impossible concept in physical nature. It is the kind of concept that leads to mysticism and religion, and most religions, of course, do have a teleological explanation of the universe. That is, that the universe is such as it is because God made it. Therefore, whichever was God's purpose, that determined the nature of the physical entities in the universe. But observe this, the concept of final causation is a very valid one. And the clue to its application is precisely in the religious views of nature. Only it doesn't apply to nature, and it doesn't apply to religion. Religion makes it apply, but religion is nothing for us to consider. Observe what is the essence of final causation. What is necessary for the phenomena of final causation to take place? A purposeful consciousness. Final causation applies only to the work of a conscious entity, specifically of a rational entity, because it requires a rational consciousness, a consciousness able to think in abstractions, to choose a purpose ahead of its existence, then select the means by which that abstract purpose will be achieved. Therefore, the realm in reality to which the concept of final causation does apply is the realm of human action. And in this realm, everything that man does is in fact, is or rather has to be directed by the process of final causation. Beings allow themselves to be moved by efficient causation, that is, to act as if they were in fact inanimate objects or determined beings, that the reason of their actions is the immediate propulsion of some event around them or some immediate cause outside themselves. That is the totally improper human state. That is why I say, if or to the extent to which they allow that to happen, they need the help of a psychologist. But the proper human action is the action by means of final causation. What do we mean by that? The selection of a purpose and then of the means, the steps to achieve it. Now let me give you examples of final causation as it pertains to human beings. Well, the first and most obvious one pertains to every writer. When you plan to write a book, it is your idea of the theme of the book, or the general outline, that will determine what you will select to concretize it. The overall projection, the abstraction of the book, will determine what steps, what chapters, what events, what particular sentences you will select to present it. There you see, it is a cause set in advance that determines what you will select in order to achieve it. But the finished product, that is the book itself, will be subject to the laws of efficient causation. And in the minds of the reader, it will function by the laws of efficient causation. In other words, the final product, the book, will be the sum of the concrete parts. Namely, if you want to write a book, let's say, on individualism, that is your final causation. How will you achieve it? By the kind of events you include. Why is it a book on individualism when it's finished? Because the particular steps which you have chosen to include add up to the final purpose, which is the presentation of the theme of individualism. And that is the way the reader will read it. You remember we spoke about the circle of your projection of a book, where you had to first conceive the abstractions, then decide what concretes were illustrated. And the circle is then reversed for the reader. He first gets the concrete as he reads your book, and they add up in his mind with into the abstraction which you intended. That is, if you're a good writer and have carried out your purpose. Now that is the arch example of the relationship between final causation and efficient causation. You, as a writer, no matter what premise you're on philosophically, in fact, have to function by final causation. You have to decide what kind of book are you going to write, about what, then select the steps and the means which will achieve it. Every reader, of course, reading your book has to follow the process of efficient causation. He has to go step by step through your book in order to get to the final result, which is the abstraction you intended. Now, any human activity, any purposeful activity, follows the same progression. If a man makes an automobile, he has to first decide what kind of object is he making, It's an automobile for what purpose, of what kind, with what sort of motor, etc. Then, according to that purpose, he selects the concretes which, put together, will make that automobile. Man, by the process of final causation, you see, has to choose to make nature perform the process of efficient causation, which is the only process nature can perform. That is, if he wants to make an automobile, he has to put together certain parts in a certain scientific order so that he will achieve a vehicle which moves, etc. In nature, there is no final causation. But in man's action, final causation is the only guide properly possible to him. Or in fact, to be very exact, man can never escape from final causation. The extent to which he might approach it, the examples I mentioned earlier, is the man who lets himself be motivated strictly from the outside, even then his own volition is involved. In a sense, if he decides, my purpose is not to have any purpose, that is still a choice and a very bad one. Now observe how it applies to the issue of a plot story versus a saga. In a plot story, men and events are pulled forward by a purpose. In a saga, or a diary, or a memoir, or an autobiography, a bad autobiography, the form is that men and events are pushed from behind, as in physical nature. Something happens which leads to something else, which leads to something else, but there is no choice or purpose in any of it. Now, do you see from this why a novel of the romantic school will necessarily have to be a plot novel, and a novel of a naturalistic school will be plotless? Or at best, it will have events, but events in the form of a saga, not purposeful events. There are writers, and I think the best examples, and they're good writers, of the plotless storytelling, which is not plotless in the naturalistic sense, but still on the order of a saga, would be Ben Hecht and Somerset Maugham. Now both have written a great number of stories, and good short stories, that is, short stories in which something happens, but they are not purposeful, volitionally chosen events. They are always events that happen to a character, events set in motion by something outside of the character's own choice. Now, it's at this point that I want to prove to you why I started by saying that I personally consider plot the most important thing in a novel, and why that's an objectively proper choice. I say it personally because in literature that stands today, plot is not considered an essential. In fact, all the modernists consider plot evil and sneer at plot as low grade. In the literature of Atlantis, that is, you projected as an ideal society on my premises, nobody would ever write anything without a plot, because men will be very much on guard against contradiction, and there is a fundamental contradiction in the premises of the naturalistic or determined school of writing. Try as a psychological experiment sometime to read a so-called naturalistic novel, constantly reminding yourself, keeping in mind that the characters in that story are robots, that whichever happens will necessarily happen, that they can't help it. Tell me, can you project offhand that you will be bored within 10 pages? In fact, if you keep reminding yourself of that premise, you won't be able to go on, because there will be no sense in it. The contradiction in the naturalistic school is, in effect, like philosophically, the fallacy of the stolen concept. They're counting on that which they're denying in order to function. The only interest in reading any naturalist story, such as Anna Karenina or any of the lesser ones, the reason why you're interested in reading what's happening to human beings is only because you assume, by implication, non-verbally, that these people have choice. If you see a woman hesitating between leaving her husband and going with the man she loves, or giving up the man she loves and staying with her husband, that is a very crucial, very important choice in her life. It can interest you only if you assume that she has choice about it, that she's free to decide, and therefore you would want to know why does she decided, and did she decide right or wrong. But if you firmly hold the idea that after 25 pages of preparation and hesitation, and the author giving you all the nuances of her feelings and her hesitation, you remember that through all of that, she had no capacity to choose. She had to do whichever it is that fate or God determined her to do. And there is no meaning for you in finding out whether she was right or wrong in that decision. Because should you ever be in any comparable situation, you have no way of knowing what you'll do. You'll do whichever you were determined to do. You can learn nothing from her story, because there's no reason why it would apply to you. And you have no way of knowing how you will act, because something will determine it, but not your choice. That story will have no meaning for you whatever. Just as you would not read stories about puppets, but I now mean puppets who are not given human attributes, but literally wooden matchsticks, or stories about stones or tree branches, engaged in conflicts, if you can imagine such a thing, or deciding something, except that they can't decide. You would not be able to write such a story, nor even conceive beyond 2 sentences. Observe that any time the form of a fable is used in fiction, or in fairy tales, or in animated cartoons, that is, you're using animals for characters. The animals are given human attributes. They are given voice and speech and choices and the power to make decisions. Without that, you could not make a Mickey Mouse cartoon. So that in the whole approach of the naturalistic school, there is this basic contradiction. If, in fact, man has no choice, one cannot write, nor is there any purpose in reading a story about them. If they have choice, then there is no sense in reading about unchosen events, in which the sole meaning is they happened because they happened. If man has choice, then what one wants to read about, what one would have rational reason to want to read, is about human choices, the right and wrong of it, their decisions, and what they should have decided, which means a free will, moralistic, romantic story. You understand what I mean by free will? By moralistic, I mean including values, dealing with values, concerned with values. By romantic, I mean all that plus the crucial form in which that view of life would be projected, a plot story. Now, to go in more detail into the question of plot. If you start with the premise that man has the capacity to choose a purpose and to achieve it, then implied in the capacity of choice is, of course, the capacity to achieve it and the necessity to achieve it. Meaning that if a man is not a determined being and sets his own purposes, then it's he who has to achieve that purpose, and it's he who has to devise the means to achieve it. If all that is given to him or set by some agency outside of himself, then he has no choice and we're back in determinism. If we're on the premise of free will, then it necessarily implies that man has to choose a purpose, and he has to achieve that purpose. Now, what does that mean in the events of his life? It means that some kind of action is necessary to achieve the purpose. Now, if that action has no obstacles, and if man decides to go to the corner grocery, he goes, and he buys his groceries, and he comes home, there is a free will, purposeful action. But that is not a story. Why? Because there was no struggle involved in the achievement of his purpose. There was no opposition. An event of that kind does not illustrate the idea of free will, namely the idea of an achieved purpose. If you want to illustrate purpose as such, you have to show obstacles, and you have to show men overcoming these obstacles. Now this is a statement pertaining strictly to writers. Philosophically, that is metaphysically, in the nature of reality, you don't have to have obstacles in order to achieve a purpose. But since all art is an arrangement of reality according to your values, and you are projecting the view of a man achieving a purpose, merely reciting how he achieves that purpose does not present the actual moral meaning of your theme, if your theme here is free will. By theme, I don't mean now the theme of a novel, it's an unfortunately chosen word right now. I mean the premise, the view of life which underlies your construction of this particular story. If you want to illustrate the fact that the man is achieving a purpose, then you have to dramatize it. By dramatizing it, I mean put it into a stressed action form. What do I mean by stressed? That which you isolate and present the particular meaning which you want your events to illustrate. For instance, if I wanted to show the career of a creative, independent architect in the Fountainhead, it is conceivable, it's possible but not probable, that in real life he would start out, immediately find the right kind of clients and go in a straight line from one building to another and achieve a great success without any opposition. It's possible, but not only is not probable, but more than that, artistically it would be completely wrong. Because if the purpose of my story is to show that a man of integrity, of creative independence, will achieve his purpose regardless of any opposition, then constructing a story in which there is no opposition does not present or dramatize my purpose. I therefore have to show the hero involved in a difficult struggle, and the worse I can make it, the better for my purpose, the better dramatically. Then I do show in dramatic form, means in action and event, that a man of integrity will achieve his goal regardless of any obstacles. And then it's up to me, to the author, to devise the worst obstacle possible, that is the hardest, and those of most, of greatest significance to the hero. As an example, if he has a distant cousin who doesn't approve of his career, and he tells her, go to hell, I want to be an architect, that's not a great obstacle to overcome. But if the woman he loves, and the only woman he ever loved, objects to it and tries to tempt him to give it up, and he says, no, I prefer to be an architect, and he has to lose that woman, or take the chance of losing her forever, that is a real dramatization. Because there, it's an important conflict. He is in the middle of a clash of two values, and he has to choose the right one, which he does. That is dramatizing a struggle against the worst obstacle possible. As an aside here, I said the clash between two values, and someone literal-minded should remind me that I said in Gold's speech that in a rational man's life there are no clashing values. So just as the philosophical explanation, I'll remind you that in this case the fault was the heroine's, it was Dominic's. She was guilty of an not irrational but very mistaken philosophy. And in fact, once she came to the right philosophy, there was no clash, and the two values, love and career, coincided and united. You might ask, but what if he fell in love with a totally irrational woman who never corrected her view? Well, a rational man wouldn't do that, or not for long. Once he would see that she's irrational, there would be no love involved. This is just a philosophical aside. What I'm leading up to is that in a proper plot construction, the more struggle a story involves, the better plot it is, for the reasons which I stated. Because whatever are the values and purposes involved in your story, to make it a dramatic, meaning action story, you have to show the kind of conflicts which a man has to resolve, in which he has to make a choice and make the right decision. You as an author are showing constantly which decision is the right one, or in the case of characters who make the wrong decision. What you're dramatizing is, why is this a wrong decision? What kind of consequences does it lead to? Therefore, the essence of a good plot structure is struggle, therefore conflict. Because without a proper conflict, no struggle is possible. And this leads us to the fact that to have a proper, purposeful progression of events, you need a climax. You need that event in a story which will ultimately resolve the purpose with which the story or the hero started, which all the events dramatized and which are finally resolved. I say here the story or the hero because the two are not necessarily synonymous. In a simple one-line story, the two will be synonymous. Whichever is the hero's purpose, the climax will resolve it. In a very complex structure, like Atlas Shrugged, although the climax has to resolve the hero's purpose, it has to do more than that. It has to also involve and resolve all the purposes, all the clashes and the conflicts of the main characters involved in the story and connected with the hero. So that the climax has to be that point in the story where the achievement or possibly destruction of the purpose comes to its final stage, that towards which all the events of the story were leading.